Let's talk about the new 8.3.0 PTB developer update. Hi, I'm Mima, and I'll preface this video with the fact that I am a Survivor main, so a lot of my thoughts and opinions will be coming from that perspective of gameplay. Starting off strong, the biggest change is that to the mori system. With this new finishing mori update, the killer can now perform a mori on the final survivor without using an offering. I don't think it's clear whether they're getting rid of the whole mori system with ivory and ebony moris, or just the yellow cypress mori. How do I feel about this? I'm worried that adding moris to essentially the endgame base kit is going to lead to even more slugouts when there are 2 survivors left. In my experience with killers who bring a yellow mori, at 2 survivors left, most of the time they opt to slug the first survivor they come across, chase the second, and then have their pick of which to hook and which to mori. You could argue that when you're down to 2 survivors, your chances of both escaping are pretty dire, but I believe the last one should still at least have a chance at hatch, which would require the killer to sacrifice the other player and not slug them for the 4K. And I think that close endgames like that can be super fun. Of course, not every Cypress Mori killer is like this, but it's something I've noticed about most of them that I've encountered. Now for survivor perk changes. I'll go over which changes I believe are the most impactful first, and then I'll gloss over the ones I don't see people use that often. We're Gonna Live Forever, a classic perk that aids survivors in altruistic actions, had a huge buff that increased the healing speed and reworked the endurance system. And as a side note, I love the dev team, but I want to know what game they are playing when they say that survivors aren't left in the dying state often. I rarely see anyone run Blood Rush, but I still think that significant changes have been made that might lead to more survivors using it. Originally, Blood Rush made you sacrifice a health state to remove your exhaustion, and now it gives you a set amount of time after being unhooked to instantly recover from exhaustion with no side effects. Probably the one that I'm most sad about, the distortion nerf. Now, instead of utilizing a token system that is charged by staying in the killer's terror radius, distortion is an on-off perk that can only be reactivated after you are in a chase. I totally understand concerns about some survivors who use the perk to hide out the whole game, but I don't believe taking away the only hard counter for aura reading perks when they're continuing to add so many more killer aura reading perks is the answer. The people who play stealth and refuse to help the team are going to play that way regardless, and I think removing distortion is just going to bring back the hiding in lockers meta for those kinds of players. What I would propose for the distortion change is keeping the token system, but tying the token charges to something that forces players to progress the game. Either charging tokens through chase with the killer, repairing generators, or rescuing teammates. That way, even if there are survivors who aren't necessarily playing with the team, they are still forced to progress the game. And I would really love to hear anyone else's thoughts about this PTB change in particular. As for the other survivor perk changes, I've never really seen anyone run the teamwork perks outside of meme duo builds, but they both have been buffed. Inner focus has been buffed. Corrective action has been buffed. Poised has received a huge buff, and maybe more people will use it now. And Lucky Star was also buffed. Now for the killer perk changes. Genetic Limits was reworked such that now, anytime a survivor loses a health state, they suffer from exhaustion for a couple of seconds. This definitely is a buff that I believe makes this perk a lot more fair and usable. Leverage was buffed, removing the token system so the reduced healing effect is applied at the get-go. Deathbound was buffed. Zanchin Tactics was reworked. It was a niche and useful perk before, but now they've buffed it in a way that gives more info on survivors. Deadman Switch was reworked. It now only applies to 1 survivor on the generator, but its duration is longer now. Hex Crowd Control got an insane buff, where its vault blocks are now permanent until the hex is cleansed. Predator was a useful perk before, though it has been reworked and buffed with a different effect that reveals survivor auras. There are some significant changes to both sides, and for the most part, these are all changes that were made to strengthen perks and make them more useful for their users. And once again, this is coming from someone who mainly plays Survivor, so I'm sure some of these buffs can be subjective. As for the killer updates, they've slowed down the Skull Merchant a little, the hindered effect survivors would suffer when being scanned has been reduced, and the Skull Merchant no longer gains haste when scanning a survivor. Her drones have also been altered. The drones are now active the whole time, and invisible to survivors beyond 16 meters, though they now only have one scan line instead of two. As someone who both plays Skull Merchant and plays against her pretty often, I see this as a bit more of a buff than a nerf. Yes, her speed has been nerfed, but the drones are much more powerful. I think that these changes will make it easier for the survivors to navigate drones when not in chase, but also easier for the Skull Merchant to lead survivors into drone scan lines and force a health state while in chase. The Hillbilly has been tweaked to balance his overdrive mechanic a little better. Victor in the Twins has received a minor nerf, and the Unknown has been tweaked to balance their power a little better. As always with the PTB, we still have to see how these changes play out and affect gameplay, and moreover, if all of these changes even make it to the final game. This does feel like one of the more substantial updates we've had in a while, so I would love to hear if anyone has any thoughts about any particular updates. Cheers!